Hi, this is Patty Hodge at Dr. Nurses Rock. And this is one video in a series of 30 videos that we're producing throughout the month of April this year on topics of grief. And you will recognize this face of Dr. Bob Baugher. He was here earlier in the month to talk about proxy grief. And today he'll address the topic of what happens when we don't address our grief, how that manifests in our life. So I'd like to say welcome, and I'm glad you're back, Dr. Bob.
Thanks.
So
Great.
tell us, where do you want to start with this topic of what happens to people when they don't address their grief?
I want to start with the term grief work, which is a great term, and I'm going to give a definition that I like. Grief work refers to, and of course, this is after someone dies or after we lose someone in any relationship, but grief work refers to confronting the emotions uh, and feeling the pain of the loss. And it also, means confronting the reality of it as well. And so the question is, does everyone need grief work? Does everyone need to accept the reality, to talk about it, to feel it, and so on? And when we think about, all the cultures across the world, there are 200 countries, and within the countries, there are different cultural expressions, different religions, and so on. And so, when we take a look at it from that perspective, we understand that there's some people who do apparently do just fine without having to confront the reality and the pain of the grief. And I think in the United States, in our culture, the whole idea is, we got to talk about it, and we got to feel it and experience it and so on. And so I think that's how we're brought up to understand how we deal with it. And that people then who don't do that, then somehow this may show up later. And that's, that's, there's a kind of a Freudian terminology to this where people who keep something inside at some point it's going to explode, and and if we keep it inside, then it's going to show up in other ways. It's going to sort of leak out as for example, with defense mechanisms, ego defense mechanisms. People will then have rationalize and repress and do all those kinds of things. So it may be that some people, may be able to just get through their grief in their own way, not talk about it, not cry, not be upset, and try not to think about it. But what we do find is that there are people who arrive at the grief counselor's office years later, realizing that they haven't dealt with it. And in my experience with students who sign up for my class called Death and Life, and they then come into my office and say, my brother died when I was 16, and now I'm 26, and I'm realizing now for the first time that I'm beginning to deal with it, because in my class I have to keep a journal. And so here they are pouring out their feelings for the first time in 10 years. And maybe as a 16-year-old, you wanted to gut it out because you didn't want your mother or father to see how upset you were at the death of your sibling. So, and there have been cases. I had a guy write me several years ago on via email, and he said that uh, his father had died from suicide 30 years prior to that. And now, in the past year, his wife had died. And the grief, both for his father and his wife, just came pouring out. And he realized back then, 30 years ago, he was a police officer. So he had investigated the suicide from a little bit from the perimeter. They wouldn't let him totally in. And he took care of things. And people were like, wow, you really took care of things. So there's a case of someone who repressed it, suppressed it, went on with his life, and then at some point later, something else triggered it. And when he was crying, there were times he didn't know whether he was crying for his father or his wife.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's where I wanted to begin with this whole idea of grief work is that yeah, and because we're all so individualistic, for some people, maybe they can do just fine, suppressing it, keeping it inside, not talking about it, not crying, and moving on with their life. But for other people, it they may pay a toll later on.
Yeah. Well, I guess as a nurse, I worry about the people who pay the toll. Because as a therapist and a nurse, people would walk in and it was hard to decide, were they depressed or were they grieving or both?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that the body chemistry reacts to loss just like any other thing that, the food you take in and the sunlight that you take in, it does respond to the grief that you experience and things do change in people. So over time, what what are some of the things that we claim happens to people who repress this grief? That may be if it's myth or real or whatever. What will we look for?
Well, yeah. One is that the person, is walking around angry, and their threshold for anger has gone down, so they get ticked off more easily. Or, later on that they go to a movie. A friend of mine whose brother died of alcoholism. She's a psychologist, and 5 years after her brother had died, she went to see a movie. I think it was called Leaving Las Vegas or something like that, where the main character was an alcoholic, and she began sobbing. And this is in a theater so much that she had to leave. She couldn't breathe, right? And so here she had thought she had dealt with it, and then what do we see years later? Something triggers it, and here they are in the midst of trying to figure out what's going on. I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone a couple days ago, and we were talking about grief and loss and so on. And um, one of the things that a counselor said to me, a grief counselor, said to me years ago was, she said, well, she's a counselor in general, but she said every person who comes to her, she feels that she needs to investigate the losses that they've experienced and that they may come for her for this reason. But once they dig down, she said pretty much in every case, she found that people hadn't dealt with their losses. And here it was showing up in other ways where they were having problems in relationships and depression and so on.
Yeah.
I do want to make a contrast between, as you mentioned, depression and grief. This is from the DSM-5, so I'm going to kind of read it here. That for grief, the person has thoughts of, where they have preoccupation with a person who died. Okay, with major depressive disorder, the person is self-critical. They feel worthless. They feel a burden. With grief, the waves of emotion, wash over them. With major depression, quite often the depression is, persistent. With grief, if they have suicidal thoughts, it's of joining their loved one. For a major depression, suicidal thoughts is I'm undeserving of life, and I should just die. So I thought, that's an interesting contrast between the two that is right out of the DSM-5.
Yeah.
For your viewers, the diagnostic uh, for major diagnostic statistical manual for major for mental disorders is about 20 major disorders, and the book is 947 pages, that thick, as you well know, Patricia.
I know that book all too well and all of its renditions. Um, yeah, and often people don't present with all the symptoms, right out of the book. You're dealing with a certain constellation of things, and you maybe see two or three stars behind those clouds, and you figure, well, maybe that is the Big Dipper, and you move in that direction. So, Um, people are surprising, and people are resilient, and people do fall apart. So there's a wide gamut of things to look for. I guess some of the things that you just said, one thing came to mind was this very short movie. I think it's 7 minutes long. It won some kind of a prize several years ago, and I think it's out of Australia, of all things. It was Men and Road Rage. And I maybe I'll find it and I'll put a link below and people can comment on it. But one man, for some reason, is stopped in traffic. I don't know, I don't remember why. And he's holding up traffic. So the guy gets out of the car. He's going to have a fight with this guy for holding up traffic. And guy rolls down the window and he says, something about, my wife just left me and I'm sorry, I'm a mess. And so the guy who hears this all of a sudden is not angry. Like he has some compassion for it. And the guy behind him who's honking his horn, he says, hey, wait a minute, like, hey, his wife just left him. And she took the kids. And then he lost his job. And then that guy rolls down his window and it goes down this whole row of cars of men and it's like telephone game because the loss that he originally talked about is like not what they're talking about down there. They're talking about what they're experiencing, obviously. So it was such a clever way of looking at how men, I think, in some regard, deal with their grief. Because in another episode of this series, another psychologist talked about two different grieving styles and her experience with working with widowers, which I know you worked with
Mhm.
widowers often. So I think it's just my take on all of this is no matter what, I'm assuming that everybody is experiencing some type of grief, whether they know it or not. We have loss. That's a primal thing. We lose something and we have to deal with it somehow. And so if we just walked around with a little more compassion, it would be useful, I think. So some of the physical things that I think I worry about, there are things like grief brain they talk about. They talk about grief gut, which after a loss, people may have gastric disturbances, right? There's also, um, I want to know what happens in the immune system. So I'm looking at it from the physiological pieces of things that if people are not dealing with their grief, it does show up somehow. There is actually the cardiac syndrome that looks like a heart attack after someone has a serious loss. And so I'm looking for prevention all the time. I'm looking to say to people, listen, you don't have to talk about your grief and spill it all out here and now if that's not what you need to do. But be aware. Be aware that this loss has affected you. And let's move on from there. But I would love to know, like, the cultures, how they get away without looking at these things.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to be a little ethnocentric here, and I just wonder whether the cultures or religions that say 3 days and it's over, 30 days and you move on, and so on, when the person knows that that's what the edict is, but inside, are they really feeling something different in it, and therefore it's difficult to speak out and say, I know it's been 30 days, but I still feel this. And then they're accused of going against their culture and religious beliefs and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking at our society for a moment. Uh, I, uh, a psychologist got a hold of me a couple of years ago, and we ended up writing an article. Her name was Dr. Laurel Hilliker, and she and I co-authored an article that came out last year called Grief-ism. And it's the prejudice against people who are bereaved, not only at the individual level where people are saying, I'm holding my wrist up here. It's been so long, you need to move on with your life and all the cliches and all that people offer, but also at a sociological level where the very areas of our society discriminate against. At 3 days you're supposed to be over it, or even in the media. And when we see someone experiencing the death of a loved one in a movie, they never mention the loved one again. They don't show much grief. They cry a little bit, maybe a few tears, but then the movie moves on. And for people who haven't experienced significant loss, for them it's like, well, see, they move on with life and so on. And so we wrote an article, was published in the Journal of Illness and Loss, and really showing that there is discrimination against people who are bereaved in all kinds of ways, and that until our society, and this, everybody involved in grief, and until our society changes and accepts the fact that people are in pain. I was thinking about this the other day. When someone falls down, right? You're walking down the street and someone falls down. People run over to them and they want them to stand up, and they want them to be better as soon as possible, right? And that's what happens in grief,
Yeah,
right? We we don't like to put up with seeing other people in pain because it gives us pain. And and as you say earlier, the whole idea of grief being turning into body issues. Think how much work just our brain in and of itself has to do with, denying and trying to move on and not thinking about the death and the loss and the moment or the guilt or anything that you push aside. That takes a lot of work. And
absolutely.
that's what, and as you know, with some of your clients then who are able to sort of get to the other side, it frees them up, right? They don't have to work so hard moment after moment, which they may not even be realizing. So
Exactly.
anyway, you're right. It affects brain, body, you know, all of us and society.
It really does. And I love talking to you because I don't have your perspective. We look at this from a different angle. And every time I learn something new, I feel like that, that ancient story of the blind man and the elephant, right?
Mm,
Where everybody is feeling a different part of this beast and they think
mm,
it's that piece, the tail is the rope and the trunk is the whatever, the snake. And so it's such a big topic and everyone experiences it so differently and it affects every part of our being and every part of our culture. We
yeah.
can't get away from it. We're going to have loss. We have to deal with it somehow. And even we talk about how it's not just about death, that it is about any kind of loss, any kind of trauma that we have has loss attached to it, and
Yeah.
any kind of loss has some kind of grief attached to it. And it doesn't have to be the big, terrible grief where we walk around and we put on, the sackcloth and we want to, beat ourselves up. That's not really it. It is also, wow, that's a big disappointment today. Whatever happened.
Well,
Yeah.
I think about young guy, just loss in general, and being a young guy whose girlfriend, broke up with them when I was 16 years old. And I didn't know I was in grief. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. I remember when I was 20, I went to a workshop, and a woman was up there talking about her gut feelings about something. I remember as this 20-year-old guy sitting there going, what is she talking about? What's a gut feeling, right? And so just, teaching, and what do? We teach all kinds of things in school, but we don't teach about emotional intelligence. We don't teach about, how do you deal with loss?
Yes.
Yeah,
That's it in a nutshell, which is the problem. And
yeah,
that's why I want to talk about it. I mean,
yeah.
I spoke with someone else about girl grief, little girl grief, the things that happen to us. We say mean girls and clueless boys.
Mm,
And I
mm,
didn't want to make boys clueless. I don't think that's really what's going on. I said, I think that boys do this too, but they don't talk about it, so I can't be sure.
yeah.
So I asked a guy, I said, does this resonate with you? And I got a shrug.
Yeah. Yeah, we do that a lot.
It's helpful to hear it from the horse's mouth, as they say. It's helpful to hear it from a man who has these experiences and is willing to speak about it. So I'm grateful to you.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
there more to say about this topic? I have a feeling there's a ton to say, but what else would
Well,
you say?
Well, when you see people try to suppress grief, then as we talked about, it may show up in other ways. The term emotional insulation, which means that you press down your emotions and show and guys certainly learn this, and you just wonder how many problems of males later on in life, as you mentioned in that video, that shows up with as a result of them trying to suppress their grief and learning how to emotional insulate and be tough and macho and so on. And and you see that I wrote some articles. I wrote a book on crying, and you know, we don't like to see our heroes cry, especially male heroes. We like to see little tears come up, but if a hero in a movie begins sobbing, and we're not comfortable with that. And yet, that's how males brought up with this dual thing. We want males to be sensitive, and on the other hand, we don't want them falling apart. Okay, and so, part of suppressing your grief is that's what guys do. Um, and another thing about uh, suppressing your grief is that years later they may still find themselves searching if they can't accept the reality that this death has really happened. We see that, for example, in stalking. Men who have been uh, you know a relationship being severed by a woman. And, what does he do? He can't let that go. And part of it is, I think, and I don't, maybe people will be upset at this, but I think part of stalking is that they just can't deal with that grief. It hurts too much. So they keep clinging and wrecking someone's life. I've had many of my female students over the years talk about being stalked and how terrible that is and so on. And this searching is part of it. That because my brain just can't handle the fact that this loss has taken place. So yeah, I'm glad you're doing this, Patricia, because like I say with griefism, our society, needs a lot more. We have very poor role models out there for how you grieve and how you deal with loss.
Well, thank you for being here and being part of this whole thing. And again, I'm going to ask you to come back because I thought this was going to go for 30 days, and I would have done my honoring of the anniversary of this loss. And I'm seeing that people still have plenty more to say. So I think we're going well into the future here with discussions about this, maybe once or twice a month with different people who want to come in and, add to what they've said and or just explore a different topic of this. I think it's so important, and I don't want to let it go.
I think the griefism issue, I'd love to talk about that more, especially as soon as I go through the different facets of society. People go, of course, I'm just thinking about movies in and of themselves. It shows how really unhealthy our society is and not dealing with death and loss and grief.
Well, you've just given me a preview for May.
Good.
You'll come back and talk about griefism. Maybe, and the media. Griefism in the media would be a great topic.
Yeah.
That's how people are learning. People get plopped down in front of a television set as a youth and they see how people are handling their emotions. And
Yeah.
it's so unhealthy in so many different ways. And the emotional intelligence piece is, as you mentioned earlier, so crucial. So I look forward to talking to you again. I hope you'll come back. I'm going to
Sure.
wrangle you back into Dr. Nurse's rack.
Great. I'll be there.
Thanks for being here today.
Good. You're very welcome.
Bye for now.
Bye.